Whenever we think about sexual abuse, we have this tendency to default to an image of a shadowy figure in an alleyway. However, not all people are assaulted by strangers. In fact, most people actually know the person who sexually abused them. It begs the question, what is sexual abuse? Is it always obvious when it's occurring, particularly when it's occurring in a relationship? Can you be sexually assaulted by your spouse? And honestly, a big part of this is, what does consent look like? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm speaking with Lana Ubinski from the Morris County Sexual Assault Center. We discuss how sexual abuse overlaps with domestic violence, the subtle forms of sexual abuse that may go unnoticed, how to support someone who has been assaulted, resources for support, and then we go on to answer community questions and have just a really informative conversation that I really enjoyed having with Lana. But before you listen to this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us to break the silence around domestic violence. Could you just take a moment to define what sexual abuse is and what that exactly refers to?
So, sexual violence is any activity where consent is not obtained or it's not freely given. And so, sexual violence is something that impacts every community. It affects all genders, all people of all sexual orientations, ages, literally every kind of background you can think of. The perpetrator of sexual violence is usually someone that that person knows. So this can include a friend, a current or former intimate partner, a coworker, a neighbor, a family member. And this is really important because there is an idea that when we think about sexual violence, that it's kind of like the man in the dark alley, right, who's following you. And
Mm-hmm.
while that does occur, it's more of a concept that's kind of perpetuated by the media. In reality, what we see in our office is someone who's, family member who lived in the home was assaulting them. Someone's teacher was grooming them and assaulting them. So it's usually not a person that you don't know. Also, sexual violence can occur in person. It can occur online through technology. We're seeing much more prevalence of that now as technology is becoming more of a sort of, it's taking on a different role in our lives and the lives of our young people.
Hmm.
So some of this technological sexual violence might look like posting or sharing sexual pictures of someone without their consent, texting sexual imagery and language in a non-consensual, consensual, I think I just made up that term, a non-consensual setting. Um, Women and marginalized populations, such as racial and ethnic minority groups, also experience a higher burden of sexual violence. So we really have to consider intersectionality when we're looking at ways to prevent sexual violence because that intersectional identity really makes many folks more vulnerable to violence.
Yeah. A couple things I want to clarify. So, is the preferred term sexual violence over sexual abuse?
Yeah, so the if you want to think of sexual violence as the umbrella term, that is the language that we use,
Okay.
kind of in our jurisdiction. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of the same as domestic violence because, that is the overarching term, but then people tend to think it's physical violence. So it's interesting
Right.
to me with sexual violence where you said it could show up digitally, which I think that's so important to touch upon because I think people, to your point, do have this idea of sexual violence being the man in the alley. So I think this is really good to define. And,
Yeah.
to bring it back to domestic violence, how does sexual violence overlap with domestic violence?
Sexual violence can be considered a form of domestic violence.
Mhm.
So, for example, when a domestic violence survivor starts working with JBWS, the first thing that they'll start to learn about is kind of the basic psychoeducation of domestic violence, and they might be working with an advocate or a counselor who shows them the power and control wheel,
Right.
which is right. So the PNC wheel is a really valuable tool, and it helps survivors see that their experience falls within a wider pattern of abusive behaviors, and that this pattern of behaviors is quite common across people's experiences. So, when we look at the power and control wheel, you'll see there's a section that says sexual violence on it. And that's because sexual violence isn't separate from domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, sexual violence is a part of the same controlling pattern of behavior that you see in domestic violence. So, just breaking out this term abuse, right? Abuse isn't just a physical experience, it includes multiple tactics that reinforce power and control. So, to me, that's kind of how I see it. They are very interconnected, and sexual violence can be a part of the domestic violence that a survivor is experiencing. And the aim is always the same, right? It's power and control. Sexual violence is rarely about sexual attraction. It
Right.
is overwhelmingly a control tactic.
And how might they use sexual violence to control someone out of curiosity?
Want to talk more about that a little bit later,
Sure.
but it's usually something that might start very small, right? Because when we're talking about power and control, we're talking about manipulation tactics.
Right.
So it could start with something very small, like maybe I am dating somebody, maybe I'm a teenager, right? And
Hmm.
I'm dating somebody for the first time, and they are, telling me like how beautiful like my body is, how beautiful my legs are. Maybe as an adolescent girl, this is really the first time I've gotten this kind of attention from like a potential like paramour before. So I'm eating it up, right? And then that kind of attention turns into surveillance and manipulation.
Hmm.
Now it's like, what are you wearing? Why are you wearing it in front of that person? And then maybe they might use sex or sexual behaviors as punishment, right?
Hmm.
So sending pictures of you wearing that short skirt and sending it to their friends to shame you, right? So now this has become a form of sexual violence that maybe didn't necessarily start that way, but now has turned into something that is controlling.
Hmm.
I hope that helps.
It definitely does. And would you say it's pretty common for a person that's in a domestic violence relationship to also experience sexual violence? Is that very co-occurring?
It's extremely common. In fact, I was looking at some statistics in advance of our conversation today,
Hmm.
and I saw that the National Network to End Domestic Violence actually keeps statistics on this, and they report that nearly half of women who experience domestic violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime also experienced sexual violence in that relationship. So that could have been a completed act of sexual assault or an attempt. So there's a lot of overlap there that we know statistically. I would say, just anecdotally, in my role, I oversee the sexual violence program for the county. I also see patients clinically and provide counseling to a small caseload. And we see many patients in our counseling program whose partners also sexually assaulted them. And we have several shared clients with JBWS. So, there's a lot of cross referrals, people who are survivors working with JBWS who get referred to us. We refer people to JBWS. So it's extremely common.
And I think this is really, really important to figure out and to talk about because all these different instances, I don't know if people would necessarily identify that sexual violence is occurring. And so I
Yeah.
think when we talk about this, a lot of people default to more obvious instances. And I say that in the terms of like where there's a clearly non-consenting rape or something like that. But I'm curious, are there more subtle forms of sexual violence that people could look out for? Because I think you mentioned a couple, even just taking a
Mhm.
picture and shaming that person. I think that's really helpful, but other people I think might not know what all those subtle ways that sexual violence could show up. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I can give a couple examples. And, I'm sure there's so many ways that we don't even have time to cover, but I think some things that pop out to me might be in an intimate relationship where maybe sex is transactional,
Mm,
meaning that maybe one partner uses financial control to dictate the sexual practices in the relationship. So that might be, um, it could be as explicit as sort of a sexual trafficking dynamic, which happens in relationships where, maybe you're dating someone romantically, that partner begins to coerce you to have sex with friends, then maybe have sex with strangers. And now we're having sex for money and goods, right? And now this relationship has turned into a human trafficking dynamic. So that's kind of one example. Less extreme could just be, and I say less extreme, I don't really want to put measures on someone's experience of extreme assault, right? But something that maybe is more insidious or harder to see at first might be a person who is requiring sex from their partner without taking medication for known STIs or getting tested for STIs, putting that person's health at risk, withholding birth control, tampering with birth control methods. So these are all kind of things that might seem normal, right? Meaning like, oh, my partner doesn't like to use condoms, or, my partner doesn't believe in birth control, but it can also be a controlling sexual tactic in that relationship as well.
do you feel that, or do you come across survivors that struggle to identify that type of sexual violence? Is that something you have to provide education about, or do you feel it's more well known? What's your experience?
I think that it's harder for some people to see their experience in the context of sexual violence. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, our job isn't to say, like, oh no, this was sexual assault that happened to you. We want people to come to those conclusions on their own, right? Again, we want to model. An equal exchange of information with a patient that we're working with. So our job is not to say like, oh no, this is what happened to
Right.
you, but just to, right, in their own words, like figure out, well, like, how do you see it, right? How did you experience it? What felt okay or not okay? So we do a lot of that work. I would say a lot of times working with adolescents, sometimes it's harder for them to see their relationship as not okay, which makes a lot of sense because, you're younger, you know less about sex and sexuality, potentially, what a healthy relationship should look like.
Mhm.
So I would say it's maybe a longer journey with an adolescent survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a great point. You can't tell somebody, well, this is actually what happened because that's just feeding into like power and control dynamics. But,
Hmm.
I also wonder if there are added obstacles or barriers for a person that's being, sexually violated in their relationship. If they have a harder time kind of coming to terms with that than maybe what we talked about in the beginning of an assault in an alleyway that's a stranger. Do you think that that is something that comes up, that they have more difficulty coming to terms with that level of sexual violence they're in their relationship?
Yeah, definitely. There's so many reasons why folks don't immediately see sexual violence as a form of violence or even see it as like a modality for abuse or coercive control. And this is definitely, I think, like my women's studies education coming out. But we live in a world with a lot of double standards.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gendered expectations around sexuality and sexual relationships. And we learn those messages from the youngest age at school, at home, in religious institutions, on music, on TV, listening to music. So we're just inundated with these ideas and these constructs from a very early time in our human development. And now add to it, we're living in the age of the internet, social media,
Mhm.
just forget about it. And, listening to this question, I was actually thinking about how recently I watched a documentary on Netflix about America's Next Top Model. I don't know if you saw this or
Whoa.
not.
No, but I've heard about all the
Yeah.
commentary.
Yeah, so for folks who might not know, America's Next Top Model was a reality television show that started in maybe the early 2000s, and it was hosted by Tyra Banks. And one of the earliest seasons, it might even have been season one, so this is maybe going back 20 years at least at this point. There's a scene in the show where a contestant experiences what we would call an alcohol facilitated sexual assault,
Mm.
meaning that, she was under the influence of alcohol when the assault occurred. And they played the entire scene in the documentary, and I was completely flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. Um, I couldn't see anything occurring on the screen outside of a sexual assault happening in front of me with no warning. Just there was the scene.
Wow.
But yeah, but what was fascinating was that the commentary really focused more on the contestant kind of like, not being able to like hold her liquor, right? She was too drunk. She was a floozy, kind of hooking up with, hot like Italian model guys that she met. And there was just this level of ambiguity that was injected into the narrative that, watching it in 2026, I was really disturbed and horrified. And it just reminded me that we put so much blame and responsibility on the survivor to say the right thing, to wear
Hmm.
the right thing, right? There's so much onus put on them. And we miss an opportunity to really highlight that a person has a choice, right? Not to initiate sex with someone who's intoxicated. A person has a choice to stand up and intervene when someone's clearly not in a position to consent. Like someone can say something, someone can do something, someone can stop it. And so the fact that so much of that conversation was kind of overshadowed by the conversation of what the survivor did or didn't do explains to me perfectly why it is hard for people to see themselves as survivors of sexual violence, because we have this cultural parlance that really kind of makes it acceptable.
I think that's such a amazing point. I'm gonna have to watch that documentary now. I can't believe that also filming that no one would have intervened in the filming of it either is
Yeah,
absurd to me. But you make a
yeah.
really good point, which is that there are all these boxes that people who've experienced sexual violence have to check in order to feel like, oh, that counted, that was real. And so what would you say to someone who is questioning, in that situation or something similar or something different where if their experience really does that really count as sexual assault or sexual violence? What's your response to them?
So I think that if someone is wondering, was I assaulted? I think the first thing that's really important to do is just kind of normalize and destigmatize their concern,
Yeah.
right? I would warrant to say that maybe many of us have been in a situation where looking back, you know, details of an event seem murky, details of what was said or wasn't said, seem a little bit gray. So I think that that's a pretty common thing.
Yeah.
And also just kind of letting people know that so few of us are really taught that they have the right to say no. Even if at first you said yes, you still have the right to say no, right?
Mhm.
You can say yes to some things and say no to other things. And these are really lessons that, in working with schools, so one of our staff people is a preventionist, and she'll go out into the schools and things and talk about consent. And it's good that at least on some level, young people in particular are getting some of this information at least once, right? But there's so many people, myself included, I never learned about consent in school. Full
Right.
disclosure, I don't even know if I learned about it from my own parents. So,
Ah,
I don't know. I think maybe I learned about it when I went to college. Who knows, right?
yeah.
So it makes perfect sense to me that someone might look back and look at an interaction and not really know how to fully process it or make sense of what happened. And so, in those circumstances, I would really recommend that anyone in that position, if you're living in Morris County or going to school, working in Morris County, call us, right? Call the Morris County Sexual Assault Center. We do have a 24-hour hotline where folks can speak to a trained advocate who can offer support, options, basic education on what sexual violence looks like.
Mm.
And it could be just like a good soft landing for a person who's really unsure of what's going on. Shameless plug, our hotline number is 973-829-0587. So, if people listen to this and don't take anything away, I hope you take away that number. But at the end of the day, when someone doesn't know if their experience, quote unquote, counted or not, I'm not there to be a judge and jury. My job is to listen, right? And to believe what that person is sharing with me. And just those acts of listening and believing are so powerful. And I think that they might be the most powerful thing that we can do as service providers and community members.
It's amazing, really. I think very valuable information. And I'll also make sure that that number is linked in the show notes, the description. So
Yeah.
the education we can put out there is so important. I'm curious, in your role, what are some of the most common questions that you're asked about sexual violence, or maybe things people frequently misunderstand or require clarity about, or anything that kind of comes up as a topic that you think would be important uh, to address or go into?
I would say, in my experience, the number one question that I hear from survivors almost all of the time, we'll do some service planning. We'll talk about, goals that they have from seeking therapeutic support. And what I hear a lot is someone saying, how do I get over an assault and quote unquote move on with my life? Right? How
Yeah.
do I move on from this? How do I get away from this episode? And I usually take it as an opportunity to discuss what trauma is and the relationship between sexual violence and trauma, right? So, sexual violence is such a traumatic experience that is shared by so many.
Yeah.
And we can't really put a timeline on how long it takes for someone to heal trauma.
Mhm.
I wish I could. I wish I could say we're going to do, 24 sessions. And at the end, you're not going to feel any sort of traumatic response to what happened to you. And the reality is that for some people, maybe they'll get healing in 24 sessions. For some people, it might take them years.
Yeah.
It really depends on how complex that trauma was, right? When did it start? How many times? So, what I really like to focus on when people come to me with a question like that is, you know, how can I emphasize that trauma is a common human experience,
Mhm.
right? How can I emphasize that trauma can be an opportunity to affect positive change in my life and really promote my own empowerment?
Wow.
So these are the things that I want to encourage people to kind of think about and consider because we can't go in the past and change something, and we can't also predict the future, right?
Yeah.
So, how do I keep you in the moment? How do I support you in looking at your trauma and making it a part of your story, but it's not the whole story, and it might not even be the most important part of your story.
Yeah.
So that's really something that we take pretty seriously here in our counseling services. And, I think also reality check, I think it's unfair to assume that anyone can simply move on from this, right?
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine? There's things that happened to me, like wearing, like a dumb outfit in middle school. I don't think I've moved on.
Right.
Like, I'm still holding on, right? So something like this, like, yeah, it's going to take time, and that's actually normal and okay.
Yeah, wow. This is such fantastic information that you're providing. And, in speaking about this, you mentioned a little bit about trauma, but what are other ways that sexual violence can affect someone, either emotionally, mentally, physically, in what kind of way over time?
So, the effects of sexual violence and sexual trauma really mirror the experience of a domestic violence survivor very closely. So, whether in your DV experience you had sexual violence or not, a lot of those feelings and experiences and sort of behavioral, physiological expressions are the same.
Yeah.
So, feelings of fear, blame, shame, horror, guilt, these are really common. experiencing social isolation and rejection from family, friends, community, or even self-imposed, right? Isolation and rejection are both extremely common. Physiologically, we see sleep disorders, right? So sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, nightmares, disordered eating, physical injury, right? So sexual assault is there's also, clearly a physical violence component. So some people may have long-term physical damage, scarring, injury. I am working with a survivor right now who is in physical therapy for pelvic floor work, and her pelvic floor injury is related to sexual violence, right? So we see that a lot. And then agitation, flashbacks, memory loss, avoidance, inability to trust, right? Anxiety, depression, going all the way through to more severe expressions like self-harm and suicidality. These are all potential effects of experiencing sexual violence in your life, even one time. So it doesn't have to be, multiple experiences to lead to these expressions. One instance can lead to this and be lasting, right? It could follow you through your life cycle.
Yeah, really critically important to hear so people also don't feel ashamed that they haven't moved on or they can't get over it, and that's just really important.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually like share the what you can do too because I feel
Yeah.
I feel funny about just leaving it on. These are all of the, effects, but
Right. No, so true.
yeah, so I think that, if I can put an asterisk, I would also say that not everyone experiences the same thing, right? So not everyone's experience is going to look the same. Not everyone's reaction to sexual violence will be the same. So I also would warrant against assuming that a person who is a survivor feels any of the things that I just said because maybe they feel some, maybe they feel none, right? So
Yeah.
it's really such a wide spectrum. And also, this isn't a crime that happens to folks just because they have like low self-esteem or low self-concept. Some people are survivors and they have very many protective factors in their lives, right? Very few risk factors. Maybe they're very resilient, right? So their trauma expressions are going to look a little bit different.
Mhm.
So I would always recommend seeking out individual and group counseling because these are great spaces to find the commonalities amongst survivors and people from all different walks of life. So, here at the center, currently our youngest patient is a 13-year-old girl,
Wow.
and our oldest patient is an 80-year-old man, 80.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
it's just, I like to share that as a little like anecdote because people are coming in our doors with so many different risk and protective factors, experiences, cultural perspectives. And one of the things that being in a group setting or even individual counseling setting can do is really help people realize that their survivor experience is more similar to someone than not.
Wow.
So just wanted to add that.
Really incredible information. I think that that makes a lot of sense to share and make people feel that there's a path forward. But just to get to a couple of the community questions, one that came up was, is it rape if I'm married to the person?
A great question, and the answer is an emphatic yes. So in New Jersey, it is illegal to coerce or force your spouse into a sexual act. It is rape. Marriage does not mean consent unilaterally, meaning like if I say I do, I'm not saying I do to every single thing that happens in the future
Right.
into perpetuity. So it is illegal, yes, and it is rape.
If, and this is another question, if I realize that rape has been happening for years, can I report it even though I willingly had sex with them after?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes, but with a few different caveats. So, in terms of getting a forensic exam, which is something that's completed by a trained forensic nurse examiner at a hospital, you have 7 days from the time the assault happens to get a forensic exam.
Okay.
So if you're looking to report and have a forensic examination done, It's important to know that if that assault occurred a year ago, an exam won't be a possibility. But if it did happen within that 7 day window, it's absolutely a possibility. You can also always file a police report. You can request a restraining order. So for sexual violence, the restraining orders are called VASPAs. That stands for Victim
Oh.
Assistance and Survivor Protection.
Mm.
So all of those resources are still available to you. The thing that gets tricky is the forensic exam piece.
Okay, that's good information to have. The third question was, what are supportive ways to respond to respond if someone discloses that they've experienced sexual violence? And I think that's just kind of community members, friends and families, like how would they respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I always encourage just being a present and active listener. You don't have to be an expert in sexual violence or domestic violence to listen to someone and just show that you're there for them and you want to hear what they have to say. So you can do that. You can give them our hotline information. You can refrain from asking accusatory questions or asking someone to explain themselves. This happens in DV too, where people get tired of telling their story. It's like you're the fourth person I've told this to. Like,
Yeah.
I'm done, right?
Yeah.
So let a person disclose at the level that they feel comfortable at. To disclose an instance of violence is really courageous. It's very brave. And so if someone feels safe enough to disclose to you, let that person know that you appreciate them sharing that, and that, you thank them for putting their trust in you. And just model consent through what you do, right? So if sexual violence is a phenomenon of power and control, let's model consent, right? Let's model nonviolence in the way that we support other people.
Yeah. So what should someone do if they think either themselves, a friend, a loved one may be experiencing sexual violence? Is that something they bring up to them? What do they do?
Yeah, so I would say if you have concerns, definitely call the hotline. It's not just for the person experiencing abuse, right? It's for people who have concerns. And we do get those calls all of the time. I remember I was covering hotline one time and a man called because his sister, they were both adults, had just disclosed that a family member had raped her several times before she had turned 18. And even though they were adults, right, those were things that happened in her childhood. And he was like, I'm afraid for her and she doesn't want to say anything. And just validating that it's like a really tricky situation, right? If a person is an adult and just said, please don't call the police, please don't tell anybody, that's something that that person has to consider in terms of the level of support that they're giving to their loved one. Now, I will say an important note that in New Jersey, everyone is a mandated reporter of child abuse and elder abuse.
Mhm.
So any survivor in those circumstances, does warrant having that experience reported to the state for additional screening and resources.
Yeah,
I think it's important to put that out there.
it is.
Um, but, I think the other piece is that loved ones are also experiencing trauma, right? So to hear that someone you love has gone through that is also traumatic. So I would encourage loved ones to also seek support for yourself, seek resources, seek counseling, to really learn how to be a person who's by that person's side as opposed to controlling their decision making. Because again, we don't want to reiterate that sort of power and control dynamic, even if it's coming from a helpful place.
Yeah. And do you have a closing message that you want to leave people with about this conversation?
Yeah, I think if there's anything I want people to walk away from after listening to this conversation, it would be that no one is exempt from sexual violence. The only way to end it in our communities is for everyone to agree that it is happening,
Yeah.
it's a problem, and every last one of us has a role to play in its elimination.
Thank you, Lana, for all this incredible information about sexual abuse. The services you provide are incredible, and I hope everyone who is able can utilize them if they need to. All of the resources we mentioned are linked in the show notes, and there are a bunch of resources about domestic violence at the end of this episode. Please tune in next time to learn more about all facets of abuse because education is the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency that serves both Morris and Passaic County, New Jersey. If you would like a certain topic covered on the podcast, then please send an email to podcast@jbws.org. We are always striving to provide content that will be both educational and helpful to our listeners. But please note that this email is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or any access to services. If you live or work in either Morris or Passaic County, New Jersey, and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, then JBWS is here to help you. Please visit jbws.org/services to learn more about programs for support, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to a member of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you're listening to this podcast and recognize controlling or unhealthy behaviors in yourself, then JBWS can also help you to change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and teens who have used abusive or controlling behaviors. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn how you can stop the cycle of violence. If you don't live in either Passaic or Morris County, then please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Since domestic violence grows in silence, you are helping us break the stigma associated with domestic violence and supporting our efforts to unsilence those impacted by abuse. Please be sure to subscribe to Unsilenced, Real Conversations about Abuse, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow JBWS on social media to get as many people talking about abuse as possible. Thank you so much for listening and helping us to break the silence around domestic violence.